Hey, hello everyone. I hope everybody is doing well. As you can tell, both from let's put this in presentation mode, both from the syllabus and also from the lecture slide here, we are moving on in Isaiah. This first week, starting last week, was on Isaiah 1 through 12, and I offered a lecture on kind of 5 reasons why I think the book of Isaiah is really, really important for Christians to dig into, not only from a public leadership kind of ministry perspective, but also just from the perspective of a believer who wants to study the Bible. I think Isaiah is a fabulous place to dig into, and not just fabulous, but critical for Christians to have a grasp of and to have quite a bit of experience with, and unlike some other Old Testament books, the lectionary will put Isaiah in front of you on a regular basis, and so that's positive. But as is often the case with the lectionary, you're only getting a very small piece of Isaiah, and Isaiah is a really complicated book, and that will be kind of, I would say that of all the kind of sections of Isaiah, we've kind of sectioned it out in terms of 1 through 12, 13 through 39, 40 through 55, and 56 through 66. I think that this section, 13 through 39, is probably the most generically diverse section, meaning in terms of genre. The genres that are employed here. There may be, 56 through 66 has its own issues there, but 13 through 39 really strikes me as it's not hodgepodge at all. It certainly isn't chronological, but the literary blocks are very, very different. And so I thought that today maybe, and I apologize for my it's kind of allergy season right now, or just there's a lot of stuff in the air here in Arizona, and so I'm a little bit stuffy. I apologize for that. But I thought that maybe the easiest way to go about working with 13 through 39 is to look at the different sections, the literary sections. I'll talk a little bit about those in kind of broad terms, and then to dig into one of the texts from each section, just as a representative. Not to say that it's sort of all of them can be reduced to this one oracle, nothing like that, or this one particular text, but just to give us a little bit of kind of to wade into the water a little bit, as it were. And so each of these literary blocks does kind of have sort of a dominant genre. Just as an example, in 13 through 23 is really dominated by oracles concerning foreign nations, or this is sometimes, let me do an edit here, sometimes referred to as the oracles against foreign nations. And the reason that it's again, we've come across these, by the way, in our study of Jeremiah. Jeremiah has a huge section of oracles concerning foreign nations, also sometimes abbreviated. Sometimes in the literature you'll see it abbreviated that way, OAN. And these are so fascinating to me because they really they kind of make a baseline. They're basically royal decrees, prophetic decrees by God, of course, through the prophet, about and concerning and usually against. They're kind of negative, like oracles of judgment, against the various foreign nations of the earth. And hidden behind these oracles is the assumption that Yahweh is king. Right, not just of Israel, but of the earth and its many nations. And so as king, Yahweh is rendering judgments and making decrees from God's throne to the various nations of the earth. And of course, in this case, all these nations are limited to Israel's world, right? Like you're not going to find oracles against the Canadians or something like that, which didn't exist, of course, at this time. But you understand what I mean. These are primarily limited to the ancient Middle East, a bit of North Africa, but primarily the Middle East, really nothing much beyond what we would call modern day Iraq, kind of area of the twin rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates, Mesopotamia, variously called in various things, north modern day Turkey, and to the west Egypt. And so there's not really much beyond that world, but this is the world of Israel, and Israel asserted through these oracles that its God was king, that Yahweh is king. And okay, so second is sometimes called the Isaiah Apocalypse. This is 24 through 27, relatively short section. You see the quotation marks there? It is not a true apocalypse. Okay, now if we had time, or if you took like one of my Daniel class or a class on apocalyptic literature that I've taught in the past, these are not true apocalypses, right? An apocalypse is a very specific genre designation that has certain literary features and whatnot, but it is I would say this section 24 through 27 does have some themes that that emerge often in the apocalypse season. So that's why people sometimes have called it the Isaiah Apocalypse, in part just because there are some literary and theological motifs that emerge there in the Isaiah Apocalypse, or in these chapters, that do sort of suggest some maybe some cross-pollinization, from the apocalypses, or from at least literature that's similar to it. So that's why they call it the Isaiah Apocalypse. It's very, very different. It has this kind of universal scope, universal eschatological horizon that is really, really interesting, but also very challenging. 28 through 33 is kind of a series of oracles that deal with how do I put it? With the incursion of Assyria. Of course, remember, Assyria is the empire that precedes the Babylonians, and were around during the historical Isaiah's life in the 8th century. And so these oracles kind of deal with the different political, religious dynamics that emerged as a result of this dominating imperial power, namely the Assyrians. And so oracles that offer comfort, oracles that offer warning about the temptation to trust in foreign powers like Egypt to save Judah, and also sort of exhortations to trust in Yahweh. So there are a number of oracles there, 28 through 33. We'll look at just one of those. 34 through 35, you get another kind of oracle concerning the nations, this one in particular concerning Edom. And then in 35, a particular emphasis on the exiles. This is so interesting, right? Because most of this stuff here, 13 through 39, does not deal explicitly with the exiles, because most of the material that speaks to the exilic community comes after 39, namely 40 through 66. And so, that of course causes all kinds of gives birth to all kinds of theories about, why are these chapters there? Why are these post-exilic chapters, or these exilic chapters? Why are they here in the first place? And so that's interesting questions, but for us, it's just another kind of literary block with a different kind of material that seems to be addressing the community of the exiles. It's much, much similar, especially 35, is much more similar to 40 through 55 than it is to any of the material that really surrounds it in Isaiah 1 through 39. And then finally, we kind of end on a narrative note. We end the kind of 1 through 39 on a narrative note that really leans toward the exile, but that begins with Judah's collision, the collision between Judah and the Assyrians in the person of, in the emperor of Sennacherib and his various deputies, as it were. And so there is going to be, and this is historically known, there was some kind of conflict, between Jerusalem and the Assyrians. And what 36 through 39 represent is the kind of Isaianic interpretation of those of that encounter. So we'll look a little bit at that. But the idea is to see that each of these sections is, this isn't a perfect statement, but it kind of works generally. Each of these statements is kind of dominated by a particular genre or kind of literature. And so I thought that might be the easiest way into understanding 13 through 39 is to sort of look at a representative text, talk about how it relates to the surrounding text, and talk a bit about the theological aspects of each text. So that's where we're going. Let's begin with the oracles concerning or against the foreign nations, and we will read 19:1 through 25. I chose this one in part because it is both typical and atypical of a genre, and so it's always important, it's really important actually, when we're talking about when we're talking about genres, that we recognize that in most cases, it wasn't as if people sat down and they sort of said, "Well, I am now going to write in this particular genre," and they got out their little index book of all the different rules that go into the genre. No, it's not like that. It's much squishier and more organic than that. I mean, just think about. To put it in sort of the realm of films, think about kind of the most cliched action film, or the rom-com, right? Or what other film genres can I think of? Or this is an interesting one where you've seen some kind of breakage. The kind of traditional way, sci-fi ways of interacting around AI, artificial intelligence. In the past, there have been some very kind of scripted and well-known anxieties around this. But as AI becomes literally, AI and machine learning become literally a part of our lives on a daily basis, right? You start to see some fractures in that narrative. I think of a film like Transcendence, I think, with Johnny Depp. It kind of went under the radar of a lot of people, but I thought it was a pretty interesting reimagining of kind of the AI story. But in that it imagines kind of a takeover, a sort of a global takeover of AI, but the consequences are quite different, even though the human reactions are predictable. So, in any case, when we're talking about genre, we're really talking about literary family resemblances. So, they're texts that loosely follow a set of rules. Sometimes it's more rigid the way they follow. Like, for instance, think about in our study of the Lament Psalms, how there are often, there are usually kind of specific parts to that. And sometimes when the authors violate assumed rules around the genre, that can be actually significant. So we're going to look at one, Isaiah 19, that both kind of reflects the genre, but then also violates it, or at least moves things in a different direction. So, okay, this is an oracle concerning Egypt, and you can recognize these off the bat in Hebrew. It is a Masa Mitzrayim. The Masa is the word used here for oracle, and this is one of the most common ways in which an oracle concerning foreign nations begins. So if we were to go, back to, back to 13, we have a Masa Bavel. Right? Masa Bavel, an oracle of Babylon, or concerning Babylon. So in some ways, sometimes genres what happened here? Are specifically signaled, right? They have like there's a specific title or something. Like when we're in the New Testament, we see a parable, right? It's like, well, that's a literary genre. And sometimes they have specific labels like that. Sometimes they don't. The labels sometimes make it easier for us. See, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. The idols of Egypt will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. So God's presence here is kind of distinctly negative, right? God's coming to Egypt is going to be a terrifying thing. I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight one against the other, neighbor against neighbor, city against city, kingdom against kingdom. So God's coming somehow stirs up a civil war, terrifying. The spirit of the Egyptians within them will be emptied out, and I will confound their plans. They will consult the idols and the spirits of the dead, and the ghosts and the familiar spirits. I will deliver the Egyptians into the hand of a hard master. A fierce king will rule over them. So here we see, again, this is kind of a common way in which the Hebrew Bible imagines judgment taking place, namely the handing of one nation or one people over to the power of another. And so this was, of course, a common thing in the ancient Near East that emperors or rulers of another kingdom would come and impose their power and will on another people. This was common in the day, but it was also, at least for the book of Isaiah and many others, one way in which God rendered judgment against people. A fierce king will rule over them, says the sovereign, the Lord of hosts. The waters of the Nile will be dried up, and the river will be parched and dry. Its canals. So similarly to actually the story of Exodus, right? The Nile becomes a target of God's wrath, an object of God's wrath, something that God is going to unleash God's anger against. And so also the health of the Nile somehow is symbolic of the sort of the goodwill or the disposition of the deity toward Egypt. Its canals will become foul, and the branches of Egypt's Niles will diminish and dry up. Reeds and rushes will rot away. There will be bare places by the Nile. And of course, the Nile truly is like the lifeline of Egypt, both in terms of its agriculture, but then also religiously too. The Nile is profoundly important. There will be bare places by the Nile, on the brink of the Nile, and all that is sown by the Nile will dry up, be driven away, and be no more. This is truly an apocalyptic scenario. Those who fish will mourn, all who cast hooks in the Nile will lament, and those who spread nets on the water will languish. The workers in flax, common, commodity within Egypt. Excuse me. The workers in flax will be in despair, and the carters and those at the loom will grow pale. Its weavers will be dismayed, and all who work for wages will be grieved. So the economy is going to be kind of shattered. The princes of Zoan are utterly foolish. The wise counselors of Pharaoh give stupid counsel. How can you say to Pharaoh, I am one of the sages, a descendant of the ancient kings? Where now are your sages? Let them tell you and make known what the Lord of hosts has planned against Egypt. The princes of Zoan have become fools, and the princes of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstones of its tribe have led Egypt astray. So blame is placed here basically on the elites of Egypt, right? The Lord has poured into them a spirit of confusion, and they have made Egypt stagger in all its doings, as a drunkard staggers around in vomit. Neither head nor tail, palm branch nor reed will be able to do anything for Egypt. On that day, the Egyptians will be like women in trouble. And so here we have an explicit, in my reading of this, an explicit use of what we would call sexist language. Assuming that women would be terrified. On that day, the Egyptians will be like women and tremble with fear before the hand that the Lord God raised against them. And the land of Judah will become a terror to the Egyptians. Everyone to whom it is mentioned will fear because of the plan that the Lord of hosts is planning against them. On that day, there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan. So now things are going to start to take a really strange direction, something we don't often see in the oracles against foreign nations. So they'll speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the City of the Sun. This is so interesting right here, this particular phrase, because of course, solar religion, especially in the New Kingdom Egypt, was a really, really important part of especially Egyptian royal religion. And also it's inseparable, the royal religion and the cult of the dead. These are these are inseparable realities. But so one of these will be called the City of the Sun. So in some ways, this is an oracle that's kind of both using the conventions of Egyptian religion, but also sort of co-opting them in a way, because of course Yahweh will be the sun. And on that day, there will be an altar to the Lord. Or let me back up and say, not that Yahweh will be the sun, but that Yahweh is the creator of the sun. And so there may be some kind of blurring of lines here. And elsewhere in Isaiah, you get this kind of equation of God and the brightness of the sun, actually later in Isaiah in 60 through 62. But on that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the God at its borders, to Yahweh at its borders, right? It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. When they cry to the Lord because of oppressors, he will send them a savior and will defend and deliver them. The Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians will know the Lord on that day and will worship with sacrifice and burnt offering. This is crazy, right? Because think about, and they will make vows to the Lord and perform them. This is such a crazy statement from a book like Isaiah, which is so Zion-centric, right? In the place where these sorts of offerings are supposed to be made is in Jerusalem alone, we should say. And so it's so interesting that in this particular text, they imagine a different kind of a system in which these kinds of sacrifices can actually be offered to God outside of the Jerusalem temple. and that the Egyptians will actually be the beneficiaries of God's salvific activity, of God's saving. When they cry out to God, God will save them. And here's sort of the broader picture in verse 22. The Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing. They will return to the Lord, and he will listen to their supplications and heal them. And so this the oracle of judgment in Isaiah 19 is for the sake of bringing about a return to God. They are there, God is judging them, is striking them in order to heal them. At least that's the kind of the theological language there. And then 23, on that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrians will come to Egypt, and the Egyptians into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. On that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth. Whom the Lord of hosts is blessing. Blessed be Egypt, my people. Where is this coming from? Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. So let's pause there. This is both a normal oracle concerning foreign nations, or against foreign nations, and an extraordinary one. Normal in the sense that is God making this decree of judgment against the nations for whatever reason, different kind of violations of ethical norms or religious norms. On the other hand, there's this kind of eschatological bit, or this bit that imagines a worship happening in both Egypt and Assyria, and worship that, at least for a vast majority of these biblical texts, will happen in a way that is not really orthodox, right? That is, which you have sacrifices being made on altars outside, or your worship spaces and altars outside of Jerusalem. So this is all very strange, but also very interesting, right? So this interesting text from the perspective of the oracle concerning or against foreign nations. That also kind of breaks the generic mold and imagines things going in a slightly different way. So that's fascinating. Okay, let's resume. So that's our oracle concerning foreign nations. Let's look now at the Isaiah quote-unquote apocalypse again. I'm not going to go into super abundant detail about kind of how scholars think about what an apocalypse is. What's most important is just to recognize that while Isaiah 24 has some apocalyptic elements, or elements that kind of like literary motifs and ideas that do accord with ideas and motifs we find in apocalypses, it is not a true apocalypse, okay? So here we go. But it is definitely, this text lives in the world of kind of universal eschatology. It lives in the world of kind of thinking about judgment and redemption on a cosmic scale, okay? So it does do these things. Okay, the Lord is about to lay waste the earth and make it desolate. All right, and he will twist its surface and scatter its inhabitants. And it shall be as with the people, so with the priest. This is such an interesting line right here, by the way. As with the people, so with the priest. As with the slave, so with his master. As with the maid, so with her mistress. As with the buyer, so with the seller. As with the lender, so with the borrower. As with the creditor, so with the debtor. In other words, the normal kind of sociological distinctions that are made between people who have power, or let me just say, this is not only about people with and without power, but it's about different power relations and different kind of relations that sort of emerge within societies. So all of those power distinctions will be eviscerated in that day, the day when, as verse 3 says, the earth shall be utterly laid waste and utterly despoiled, for the Lord has spoken his word. So God's word will not privilege anybody. It will look beyond sort of the titles that normally sort of protect us or give us advantage within society. It will look beyond those and will ignore them. It will basically ignore them, and God's word will touch everybody. The earth dries up and withers. The world languishes and withers. The heavens languish together with the earth. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants. Now, this is interesting here. This kind of cosmic language where the creation itself is so deeply affected by human sins, right? Or as it says here, those who have transgressed laws or violated statutes or broken the everlasting covenant. Basically, the violation of these sins has a cosmic effect on the world. We saw this, I've said this so many times, I can't remember, but we see this, of course, with the Genesis 3, right? That one of the consequences of the first family's sin is that death is basically introduced to creation, and you have the earth reacting with thorns and thistles, and the earth not giving its sort of its abundance as easily. So creation becomes adversely affected by human sin, and we see this on a cosmic scale. Not just the earth, but also the heavens, right? The fact that they use both of these is it's a kind of merism that states two ideas as a way of talking about everything in between, all and everything in between. So the heavens and the earth, right? The waters and the seas. We do this kind of stuff in the English language too. So the earth is polluted under its inhabitants. They've transgressed the laws, violated statutes, broken the covenant. Therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth dwindled, and few people are left. The wine dries up, the vine languishes, all the merry-hearted sigh. The mirth of the timbrels is stilled. The noise of the jubilant has ceased. The mirth of the lyre is stilled. So all these signs of celebration and of joy and abundance. It's interesting the way that this oracle kind of includes both the visual and the auditory, right? It's not just that the earth is desolate visually, but also even the sounds of abundance and life and celebration are muted. Or silence. No longer do they drink wine with singing. Strong drink is bitter to those who drink it. So even the drinks that are so indicative of celebration don't even taste good anymore, right? They don't even generate or accompany the mirth that they normally would. They are in fact bitter. The city of chaos is broken down. Every house is shut up so that no one can enter. There is an outcry in the streets for lack of wine. All joy has reached its eventide. The gladness of the earth is banished. Desolation is left in the city. The gates are battered into ruins. For thus it shall be on the earth and among the nations, as when an olive tree is beaten, as at the gleaning when the grape harvest is ended. They lift up their voices, they sing for joy, they shout from the west. Oh, this is where there starts to be kind of a transition. They shout from the west over the majesty of the Lord. Therefore in the east give glory to the Lord. In the coastlines of the sea glorify the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. From the ends of the earth we hear songs of praise, of glory to the righteous one. So this is interesting. You're going to get two kind of responses to all this desolation. On the one hand, there will be some who glory in this, who see this as a sign of the glory of God. So they will, presumably experience this or see or hear reports of this terrible disaster, but they will see it as the manifestation of God's glory. Perhaps we might be pushing it a bit here, but they may also see it as a sign of salvation, that God is sort of delivering them from some kind of oppression or sin. From the ends of the earth we hear songs of praise, of glory to the righteous one. But I say, I pine away, I cry, woe is me, for the treacherous deal treacherously, and the treacherous deal very treacherously. Terror and the pit and the snare are upon you, O inhabitant of the earth. Whoever flees at the sound of the terror shall fall into the pit, and whoever climbs out of the pit shall be caught in the snare. For the windows of heaven are opened, and the foundations of the earth tremble. The earth is utterly broken, the earth is torn asunder, the earth is violently shaken. The earth staggers like a drunkard. That's such an interesting image, don't you think, just from a metaphor perspective? What does it mean that the whole earth is kind of staggering around? I remember after certain festivals in Finland, public festivals, you would often find these drunks staggering around. I remember one time we had to take one of our Great Pyrenees in for an operation. He had hurt his foot, and he would, we were close enough to the veterinarian office where we could walk our dog to the vet and then walk him back. But on the walk back, he was still pretty drugged up from whatever anesthesia they had to put him under. And as my wife was walking him home, this drunk guy was on the sidewalk, and he was very drunk and staggering, just like the text says. And he started pointing at our dog and laughing because our dog was also staggering and literally falling over on the sidewalk. The dog would lose its balance, and then he would fall over and lay down on the sidewalk for a bit, then try and stand up and stagger and fall over. And this drunk guy was laughing at him, presumably because he sort of saw himself in the mirror. I'm not quite sure. That's the image that comes to mind when I read it. It sways like a hut, its transgression lies heavy upon it, and it falls and will not rise again. On that day the Lord will punish the hosts of heaven in heaven, on earth the kings of the earth. Excuse me, they will be gathered together like prisoners in a pit. They will be shut up in a prison, and after many days they will be punished. Then the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his elders he will manifest his glory. And so, for all the terror that this chapter depicts, ultimately at the center of the theology of this chapter is that this disaster is somehow a manifestation of God's glory. And as is almost always the case with these eschatological texts, it is centered in Zion, right? Yahweh's reign is in Zion and in Jerusalem. And this Zion-centric theology persists into Christian texts. We see especially in a book like Revelation, that is an apocalypse, true apocalypse. But all of this terror, all of this glory is really finally what it looks like. Let me try and put it in a different way. Isaiah 24 is one example of what it looks like for God's glory to show up on earth. It is both terrifying and comforting, depending on a whole range of different things. But God's glory is, you read a chapter like this and you start to hesitate about praying for God's glory because it's a little bit, it's like, watching some kind of crazy zombie movie or something. Good stuff, just apocalyptic things happen, cosmic upheavals happen, and that is terrifying, right? So that's Isaiah 24. Again, just one representative text out of the Isaiah apocalypse gives you some sense of what's going on there. Okay, let's move on to 28 through 33. We're going to look at one of these oracles, which really, like I said, deals with this period of time in which the Assyrian Empire comes into direct conflict with Judah in particular, as we'll see in a later story. At one point, it even leads to a siege of Jerusalem. It will lead to the siege and destruction of Lachish, which is not far from Jerusalem, another Judahite city. Judah is really, as the title says, in the path of the Assyrian war machine. And Isaiah, this little section is going to offer some oracles oriented around that series of historical events. So Isaiah 31, we'll just read 1 through 9. Alas for those who go down to Egypt for help, and who rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord. So this is going to be an oracle that in some ways deals with geopolitics, and it deals with religion. Of course, all sort of mashed together. They don't make these kinds of distinctions. But here's the deal. During the Neo-Assyrian period, the time when Judah, was sort of living in the shadow of Assyria, there would have been a great temptation, if you wanted to resist the Assyrians, to kind of team up with other players from the region, whether that's other players from the area of Canaan, for instance, the Northern Kingdom before it was obliterated, or Aram, or any number of other powers, Moab, other powers that could have allied with you to provide a kind of stronger front to push back the Assyrian influence. Egypt was one of those powers. This is not the height of Egyptian glory, keep in mind, right? This is not a time when Egypt is sort of ruling over the entire Near East. No, but Egypt would have been, a more significant power than Judah would have been. And so there would have been a great temptation to trust in Egypt to help deliver them from the Assyrians, or at least to be a strong ally. And that's the temptation sort of discussed here in very, theological terms. Because to trust in Egypt for the author of this oracle is to mistrust God. It's not to trust in God. Yet he too is wise and brings disaster. He does not call back his words, but will rise against the house of the evildoers and against the helpers of those who work iniquity. The Egyptians are human and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble, and the one helped will fall, and they will perish together. And so basically, those who trust in Egypt are inviting death. Okay, that's at least the idea of the oracle here, that you think you're getting help, but actually you are speeding your path to death. For thus the Lord said to me, as a lion or a young lion growls over its prey, and when a band of shepherds is called out against it, is not terrified by their shouting or daunted at their noise. So the lion's not afraid of the shepherds, because they hadn't had David come after them yet. Just kidding. So the Lord of hosts will come down to fight upon Mount Zion and upon its hill. Here's Zion again, right? Like birds hovering overhead, so the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. He will spare it and rescue it. Turn back to him whom you have deeply betrayed, O people of Israel. For on that day all of you shall throw away your idols of silver and idols of gold, which you had sinfully made for you. Then the Assyrian shall fall by a sword, not of mortals, and a sword not of humans shall devour him. He shall flee from the sword. So and his young men and these young men shall be put to forced labor. And so again, the idea is, whom are you going to trust? Within the whole section of Isaiah 1 through 39, this theme plays out elsewhere when you compare the kings Ahaz, earlier, like in 6 through 8, 6 through 9, I think it spills over into 9, and then Hezekiah. Ahaz will be the king who trusts in these other nations who will kind of team up with these other nations to resist Assyria. This will not go well for him. Hezekiah, on the other hand, will trust in God and will see Jerusalem's deliverance. And so things go better for him. His rock shall pass away in terror, and his officers desert the standard in panic, says the Lord, whose fire is in Zion and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. So let's just stop there. So this whole oracle is about how is Isaiah calling them to respond to this Assyrian crisis, and the answer is quite simply trust in God who defends Zion. Right? Don't trust in the horses of Egypt. Don't trust in your own sword. Trust only in the God of Zion, who will protect, the city. And we'll see this play out in the story as well, in particular when we get to the end here. Before we get there, though, there's this interesting little interjection in 34 through 35, where you have another one of these prophecies about a foreign nation, Edom. But then, most interestingly, you get this kind of this oracle to the exiles. Right? So strange. Most of the exilic, or most of the material that kind of directly addresses the exiles is going to be found in like 40 through 56. But one kind of sneaks in here in 35, and it's, gives cause for many dissertations and papers, and people wondering what on earth is going on here, because it also sounds a lot like 2nd Isaiah. You'll see in just a second as we start to read it. This is a great example of how Luther talked about what it means, like how difficult it is to read the text of Isaiah, because it feels like you're being kind of jerked around a little bit in different directions. So let's just read 35, 1 through 10. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. I mean, this is language, right? This Al-Tira right here. Al-Tira, Hine Elohechem, Nakam Yavo, is language that is, like, there are specific verbs here, especially the Al-Tira, Al-Tira'u, it's plural here, that is found is specifically in Second Isaiah. It's very Second Isaiah-like. Here is your God; He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Right? This is all about salvation. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For water shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. All very, very much like Second Isaiah, as we'll see next week. The haunt of jackals shall become a swamp, and grass shall become reeds and rushes. A highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveler, not even fool, shall go astray. No lion shall be there, so no threat, right? There isn't going to be a threat there. Nor shall any ravenous beast come up on it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. So here's the ransom of the Lord is another way of talking about the exiles, right? This sort of highway is a highway, of course, of salvation, but it leads back to God's city, to Zion. They shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be on their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee. And so you have this kind of strange oracle, right after the stuff about the Assyrians, that immediately is dealing with exilic realities, right? The return home, the coming of salvation, the celebration of creation. All of this is very much in line with what you find in 2nd Isaiah, namely Isaiah 40 through 55. But very strange to find here in Isaiah, 34 through, or in Isaiah 35. So it's kind of a puzzle, but it's there. Just another kind of isolated literary block, or at least into kind of a literary block that really changes tones in some surprising ways. Okay. Okay, so let's look now at the very last section that we have here, 36:1 through 39:8. And what this does is bring us to the final section of what is historically been called First Isaiah, meaning the totality of 1 through 39. And these last couple chapters are really more narrative. There are some. Let me back that up and say there are some significant poetic sections, but the poetry really serves the narrative as opposed to the other way around. And so the narrative is dominant, and there are some poetic speeches here, prayer and prophetic speeches. So just keep that in mind. And the context historically is still the reign, or is it kind of the period of Assyrian Empire, and focusing in particular on the person of Hezekiah. And I had mentioned at one point that there are kind of two gravitational centers in this first part of Isaiah 1 through 39, two kind of theological gravitational centers, and one has to do with the reign of Ahaz earlier in the book, and now we have the reign of Hezekiah. And through these two kings, the book of Isaiah kind of juxtaposes unbelief, namely the reign of Ahaz, with belief or faith embodied by the person of Hezekiah, and also you could say Isaiah, but sort of focusing on the royal theme, Ahaz and Hezekiah. So that's sort of the broader context, and the crisis that is dealt with here is really the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib's army. Sennacherib is an Assyrian emperor, and a particularly powerful one, and one that we know quite a bit about just from historical sources. So let's dig in. We're going to read 36 through 37, the narrative sections there. So give me a minute. Okay. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, so this kind of begins in almost like a Book of Kings kind of way. And in fact, I should back up and say that, that these chapters do have parallels in excuse me, in the Book of Kings. And so I'd encourage you to kind of look at those parallels. They're often very, very similar, but with some significant differences. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, King Sennacherib of Assyria came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. The king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh. So the Rabshakeh, let's see how they do this in Hebrew. Rabshakeh. This is a title. This title Rav is often used in Akkadian as a way of indicating that somebody is the chief of something. And so this is like a general, basically a general within the Assyrian army. And that's part of the reason why they use the kind of a transliterated title, and they also capitalize it. Again, just to kind of indicate that this is the title of a person. This isn't a formal name, as it were, or a personal name. So the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem with a great army. He stood by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the fuller's field, and there came out to him Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna, the secretary, and Yoah, son of Asaph, the recorder. The Rabshakeh said to them, "Say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on what do you base this confidence of yours?" So the Rabshakeh detects that they are kind of in opposition to him, that they're not just going to roll over. They're actually going to put up some resistance. And so he says, on what do you base this confidence? Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? On whom do you now rely, that you have rebelled against me? And interestingly, just as Pharaoh asks the key theological question in Exodus, so does the Rabshakeh. The key theological question in Exodus, it happens in the 4th chapter, is Pharaoh says, who is this God that I should obey you? It's something like that. I'm not remembering the words exactly, but who is this God that I should obey you? And then you'll notice at the end of every third plague cycle, you have this line that says, "So that you may know that I am the Lord." And so in the plague cycles, every third one ends with this kind of purpose clause that these things are being done almost in response to that question that you, Pharaoh, obstinately and flippantly asked. This is the God, Yahweh, the God of the, Abraham, Isaac, etc. And so, interestingly, also the Rabshakeh here asks the key question: on whom do you rely? That really is the key question for not only for the Hezekiah story here, but also for the Ahaz story too. Only in the case of Ahaz, we're going to find he was not relying on the Lord, whereas Hezekiah here will be a very different kind of example of faith. On whom do you now rely that you have rebelled against me? See, you are relying on Egypt. Here's Egypt again, right, as that alternative or counterbalancing power that Judah could have potentially relied on. So the Rabshakeh says, "See, you are relying on Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of anyone who leans on it." It's actually a really interesting image, right, of misplaced trust. "Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who rely on him. But if you say to me, we rely on the Lord, our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? Come now, make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses if you are able on your part to set riders on them." So there's a bit of mocking going on here, right? This is really maybe one example of what you might call psychological warfare, right? There is a heated conflict happening, but it's primarily happening on the level of psychology and of words. "How then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants when you rely on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Moreover, is it without the Lord that I have come up against this land to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go against the land and destroy it." So here, the Rabshakeh is not only saying, hey, look, even if I were to give you enough horses to ride, even if I were to give you thousands of horses, you wouldn't have enough riders to put on it. He's also saying, hey, look, your God sent me here. all the violence that I'm inflicting on you, this is because your God, Yahweh, and they use the personal name here, right? Yahweh, said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. Then Eliakim, Shebna, and Yoas said to the Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we do not understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. So that's an interesting little note that the Rabshakeh is, at least in the world of the story, speaking in Hebrew, presumably so that everybody will understand. Now, this Aramaic business, you might say, well, what's the deal with Aramaic? At this time in history, sort of the 8th and 7th centuries, the times of Isaiah, Aramaic was kind of the lingua franca of the day, and so it was a common language that people across language groups would use as a way of communicating diplomatically and politically. And so that's part of the reason why they say, hey, let's talk in Aramaic. But really, and the motivation is so that, presumably so that the larger population won't be intimidated, right, by the speech that's being given. But the Rabshakeh said, has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you and not to the people sitting on the wall who are doomed with you to eat their own dung and drink their own urine? Of course, that's a very kind of vulgar way of talking about the realities of siege warfare. Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, just to emphasize, right, that this is, and they emphasize here that it is in the language of Judah, meaning in Hebrew. Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king. Now notice here, this is just a little bit of an aside. Notice that the Rabshakeh uses the same formulation that the prophets use. Ko Amar, not Adonai, it's Hamelech, right, in this case. And I think I've mentioned to you in the past that this messenger formula, this Ko Amar, really comes from the world of epistolary, meaning letter writing, and also the world of royal communication. We see this throughout the Near East, that when kings are conveying messages to their subjects or to other kings, they will use this language of Ko Amar, or whatever the linguistic equivalent would have been in Aramaic or in Hittite or Akkadian, whatever it is. Do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah make you rely on the Lord by saying, Yahweh will deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me, then every one of you will eat from your own vine and your own fig tree and drink water from your own cistern. So he's basically trying to say, like, look, things aren't going to be that bad. In fact, this whole language of eating from your own vine and your own fig tree and drinking water from your own cistern, this is kind of a way of talking about the good life, as it were. And so, you know, the Rabshakeh is saying, hey, look, under my master, you can live this way until I come and take you away to a land, into your own land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. Do not let Hezekiah mislead you by saying the Lord will save us. Has any of the gods of the nations saved their land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? So now the Rabshakeh kind of brings out his king's imperialistic resume, right? And says, hey, look at all these nations that we've destroyed. All of them had gods too, and none of them were saved by those gods. So why is Yahweh going to be different? Where are the gods? And then he's going to go on and give kind of specific examples. Where are the gods of Hamat and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hands? Who among all the gods of these countries have saved their countries out of my hand, that the Lord should save Jerusalem out of my hand? So he kind of looks across all these other nations and says, look, we've conquered all these other nations who have gods like yours. Why is your God special? Why would he do anything differently than these other gods that we have conquered? But they were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna the secretary, and Yoas, son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn, so as a sign of mourning and distress, and told him the words of the Rabshakeh. When King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes too, covered himself with sackcloth, and went into the house of the Lord. So he goes into the temple in a posture of mourning and supplication. And let's see, where are we? Oh, here we are. Okay. And he sent Eliakim, who was in charge of the palace, and Shebna the secretary, and the senior priest covered with sackcloth to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. So now we have our sort of prophetic hero coming onto the scene. He's really been silent up to this point. They said to him, "Thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. It may be that the Lord your God heard the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master the king of Assyria has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words that the Lord your God has heard. Therefore lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left." When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, "Say to your master, thus says the Lord." Interesting here. So it's the same formula, Ko Amar Adonai, the same formula that was used by the Rabshakeh, who says, "Thus said my master, the king of Assyria." In this case, Isaiah says, "Thus says Adonai." And while in most cases I would say, well, this is just kind of coincidence because they're both, this is just sort of part of the court speak of the day. In this case, I think there may be some intentionality behind using the exact phrase for both messengers. And that is because 36 and 38 really is a matter of whose words will the people of Judah trust. Will they trust in the intimidating words of the Rabshakeh, or will they trust in the words of God, the words and promises of God that will, as we'll see, come forth from Isaiah? And so it may not be so accidental that you have the Ko Amar, spoken of for the king of Assyria, and also here for Adonai. "Do not be afraid because of the words that you've heard, by which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. I myself will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land. I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." The Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Livnah, for he had heard that the king had left Lachish. Now the king heard concerning King Tirhakah of Ethiopia, "He has set out to fight against you." When he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, "Thus shall you speak to King Hezekiah of Judah, do not let your God on whom you rely deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. See, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the lands, destroying them utterly. Shall you be delivered? Have the gods delivered them, the nations? Have the gods of the nations delivered them, the nations that my predecessors destroyed?" And then he gives, the Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Aden who were in Telasar. "Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sepharvaim, the king of Hena, and the king of Ivah?" Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. Then Hezekiah went up to the house of the Lord and spread it before the Lord. So here now Hezekiah is... Here you really begin to see that this is really a contest of words. Because what Hezekiah is going to do is take the words, right, the physical words that the king of Assyria has provided, and is going to place those words before the Lord. And it's really a remarkable picture of kind of the struggle of faith, right? Which is so often a matter of whose words are we going to believe. Are we going to believe these intimidating words from the Rabshakeh, who really has a lot of historical evidence to back them, right? I mean, the Assyrians were a very powerful army and did, in fact, wreak havoc across the ancient Near East. And yet, Isaiah tells him to trust, right? And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, saying, "O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, who are enthroned above the cherubim, you are God. You alone of all the kingdoms of the earth, you have made heaven and earth. Incline your ears," so just listen, "O Lord, and hear. Open your ears, O Lord, and see, hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations in their land." So, I mean, in his prayer, he says, hey, look, God, it's actually true, right? What they're saying is really true about their resume of conquest. "And have hurled their gods into the fire, though they were no gods, but the work of human hands, wood and stone, and so they were destroyed. So now, O Lord our God, save us from this hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are the Lord." Then Isaiah son of Amoz sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me concerning King Sennacherib of Assyria, this is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him. So now Hezekiah, having prayed, is now going to receive the prophetic oracle from Isaiah. She despises you, she scorns you, virgin daughter Zion. She tosses her head behind your back, daughter Jerusalem. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your servants you have mocked the Lord, and you have said, With my many chariots I have gone up the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon. I felled its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses. I came to its remotest height, its densest forest. I dug wells and drank water. I dried up the sole of my foot, all the streams of Egypt. It's interesting here what's happening. So God is kind of saying, these are the different boasts that you have made. And if you actually go back to Assyrian annalistic literature in particular, those are like the kind of court histories of the king. They do speak in this way about the different conquests that they've had, how they've gone up certain mountains and cut down particular trees and sent them back home, sometimes for the use in construction. The cedars of Lebanon, that's not just a saying that has credibility today. These trees were kind of sought after in temple building. But also sometimes these Assyrian kings would send plants back to be part of their personal royal gardens, and so they would boast in the way that is being depicted here. And so, have you not heard that I determined it long ago? I planned from days of old what now I bring to pass, that you should make fortified cities crash into heaps of ruins, while their inhabitants, shorn of strength, are dismayed and confounded. They become like plants of the field and like tender grass, like grass on the housetops, blighted before it is grown. I know you're rising up and you're sitting down, you're going and you're coming in, and you're raging against me. Because you have raged against me and your arrogance has come to my ears, I will put my hook in your nose. This is another image that is found in some of the literature and even the art of the Near East. It's a kind of image of servitude, of conquest, that sometimes you'll see these images of people. I think this is actually a Babylonian image, maybe from the time of Nabonidus. It's a little bit vague in my mind, but I think it's actually at Das Pergamon Museum in Berlin. I think they have at least a recreation of the stela where there's an image of a Babylonian king. Again, I think it might be Nabonidus. I can't remember. And he's holding on. The king is very large, as is usually the case, and he's holding on to the string, and or maybe it's a chain, some kind of line, to which is attached these people from other nations who also have a hook through their mouth, or like a ring through their mouth. And so that's kind of the imagery that I think. I don't think necessarily that this text was written with that in mind, but I think that the imagery itself somehow had currency in the culture, that when they would have heard this line, I will put a hook in your nose, it would somehow resonate. I will turn your back on the way by which you came. I will turn you back on the way in which you came. And this shall be the sign for you this year. Eat what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs from that. Then in the third year sow, reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For from Jerusalem a remnant shall go out, and from Mount Zion a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Therefore thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, shoot an arrow there, come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege ramp against it. By the way he came, by the same way he shall return. He shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. So no accident here. There are a couple things to mention here. No accident that David and the city, namely the city of Zion, Jerusalem, are tied together. The fact that Jerusalem was David's royal capital is sort of tied into the whole Zion theology. Now, this is the same kind of Zion theology that we've encountered in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, except in those places it was Jeremiah and Ezekiel really fight against the application of this theology, this Zion theology, in a different historical context. And so, but here, when Jerusalem is under threat, God has a different word, right? So God's word sort of the word of promise toward Jerusalem sort of shifts and changes with historical circumstances. For I will defend the city to save it for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. Then the angel of the Lord set out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When morning dawned, there were all dead bodies. Then King Sennacherib of Assyria left and went home and lived at Nineveh. And then actually it's going to talk about his death here. As he was worshiping in the house of his god Nisroch, his sons Adramelech, it's no accident that I'm sorry, Adar. Yeah, they actually, I don't like how they do the vocalization here. Notice how it is in Hebrew. Oh, no, actually, this is right. I'm sorry, I couldn't read the values there. I thought it was Adar Melech. It's Adramelech. But notice the use of the word king. This other deity, this Adra, is a deity, and so the name of this person is basically Adra is king. So they're this is like a Hebraicized version of this Akkadian name. So his sons Adramelech and Sharezer. Yep, Sharezer killed him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. His son Esarhaddon succeeded him. Esarhaddon is another famous Babylonian king. But basically, you have here a report of Sennacherib's death. In other words, the fulfillment of Isaiah's promise that Yahweh sort of becomes an opponent now of Sennacherib. So I know that's a long story, but I actually think it's one of the most powerful stories in the book of Isaiah, in part just because of how I think it's a story that, if told properly I think you can tell the story in a way that can be easily accessible to congregation members in Bible studies, and you don't have to know, all the history behind the Assyrian Empire. You don't necessarily have to know who Esarhaddon is. You don't necessarily have to dig into how Sennacherib really died. You don't have to dig into all that stuff to be able to understand that the story is really a story of trust, and in particular of conflict between the intimidating words of Sennacherib and the protective words of Yahweh. I think there are ways of telling that story that can really connect to people's lives powerfully. So let's just kind of return for just a moment to our little presentation here. Again, the whole purpose of this lecture was to kind of go through the different literary blocks that make up the remainder of Isaiah, basically 13 through 39, and to offer at least one kind of sample text from there that gives you a sense of what's going on in those literary blocks. So I hope that was all helpful to you all, and I will look forward to interacting with you in your discussions this week. Okay, thank you.